First responders, what's the craziest thing you've witnessed? My father-in-law quit being an EMT after responding to this car accident. A drunk driver hit a pole and knocked it down. The pole went down in such a way that the wires came through a windshield of the oncoming car and decapitated a teenage girl driving. She was still in the seat and her sister was in shock in the passenger seat. She was taking napkins from the glove compartment, putting them on her sister's open throat/neck to stop the bleeding. He had nightmares about it until he died. Next story. Transport truck tire came off at highway speeds. It jumped the median and landed through the windshield into a woman's chest cavity. She did nothing wrong, not a single thing. For all I know, even the transport driver did all the appropriate checks. She probably didn't even see it coming. Just one moment she was driving on the highway, and the next she had a 60-pound tire lodged into her spine from the front and her life was over. Next story. A man called 911 and reported he'd killed his son. A few officers, including myself, arrived and he was standing on the street with the door to his second-floor apartment wide open. He was cuffed and detained in the back of one of the patrol cars. Because he was in his late 40s, I figured his son would be late teens or early 20s. Went up the stairs with my partner and entered the modest apartment to see a woman cooking in the kitchen, with her back turned to us. She was also late 40s. She turned around and was startled to see us. She didn't know anything had happened. I asked her if her son was okay, and she dropped her spatula and ran down the hallway ahead of us. We all entered the master bedroom to see an infant wearing only a diaper with a kitchen knife shoved through his chest cavity. His eyes were open, and he had obviously died instantly. The child was a foster placement, and the husband resented how his presence disrupted their lifestyle. Charles was murdered in prison. My female partner left our agency for an upper-middle-class city PD, and I drank alcoholically until I got help. Unfortunately, after 24 years of service, I have numerous stories which I could have written. Next story. Listen, there's a lot of sad, gory, rough stories here, so how about a funny one? Disclaimer, I'm but a simple paramedic. I went to a dude who was experiencing a sudden onset of short-term memory loss. Kicker is, it started midway through sex. His wife noticed him repeating phrases or questions, and then getting confused when her less than enthusiastic response to, "You like that?" was answered for the 50th time in 2 minutes. So we get there. Vitally, he's fine. ECG is unremarkable, and his LAM score is 0, so other than this sudden amnesia, he's technically fine. We treat it as a stroke and transport him to the appropriate center. Turns out, he had something called global transient amnesia. Google it, it's wild. Often it starts during vigorous exercise or commonly intercourse. It lasts up to 24 hours, and as far as anyone can tell from the studies, it doesn't have any lasting damage. The most common symptom is short-term, sudden onset amnesia with repeated questions literally seconds apart. Watching this guy know something was wrong, but just not able to fully connect the dots was heartbreaking. But I'm happy to know that he made a full recovery. Moral of the story? Women, you can F his brains out. Yeah, gonna take a step aside from the cold, depressive stories that we've read so far, and undoubtedly will continue to read, and say that because this is temporary, this is actually pretty funny. So thank you for sharing. Science, guys. What a phenomena. Next story. I took a super bipolar guy to psych. He was in really gray, worn out, not so tidy whities, and practically unconscious. The ER said to restrain him and that he was possibly dangerous due to his bipolarism, but we didn't care. He was pretty little and calm. He had threatened to unalive himself, apparently, and by law needed psych eval at a specialized facility. While my partner and I were getting him ready for the cot, he leaned in close to us and asked if we could play Eye of the Tiger on the way to the other hospital. We listened to that song on full volume probably 8 to 10 times in a row, while he sang out the guitar lines and Pound on an Ambulance. When we arrived, I went around back to let my partner out so we could get him and found him crying in her arms saying thank you over and over. I asked what happened and my partner said he'd asked if I'd vote for him for mayor and I said yes. He high-fived me while wiping tears away. We got him upstairs no problem. I always enjoy transporting psych patients. Next story. Former homicide detective. Too many things to count, but one sticks out. Grandfather got high on PCP and basically swung his 6-month-old grandson around like a rag doll. smashing him into everything. Put some dents in the walls, broke a baluster on the stairs, smashed his head into the ceiling fan and the stove. Baby died of multiple blunt force traumas to the head and suffered multiple broken bones all over his body. I went to view the autopsy. Their brain was liquefied, and then, to identify all the other wounds, they basically skinned him. They also removed his eyes to measure the hemorrhaging that occurred. Next story. Former cop. Had a guy die alone in a hoarder house. This was during the summer, and he wasn't found for weeks. Rolled into that job as a foul odor. He was completely intact besides his face, which had completely melted and decomposed. It was down to raw skull. Henceforth, he was known as Scorpion. I'll never forget that smell. Next story. All right. Honestly, I had to think. I seem to have forgotten more than I can remember. About 13 or 14 years ago, I ran a call where a 7-year-old girl came home from school. Normally, her father would arrive slightly before her. When she got home, he was nowhere to be seen, but her mother found a note at the front door. "Hey all, I'm hanging out in the backyard. Dad." The mother ran to the backyard to find her husband in a large tree in the backyard. He had taken the little girl's jump rope and tried to unalive himself. The mother grabbed the ladder, cut him down, and called 911. When we arrived, the man was laying at the base of the tree, breathing rapidly with deep snoring respirations. He had blood oozing from his nostrils and blood around the edges of his mouth. He was deeply unconscious. I instructed my partner to immobilize his spine and began to manage his airway. He was trismus, basically meaning that his jaw was locked shut. This can be seen in brain injury. To add, I found a large hematoma to the back of his head. I assume from the fall when the rope B was cut. I needed to open his mouth to suction blood out of his airway, but couldn't get it open. At the time, our treatment guidelines suggested that we feed a tube down one of the nostrils, down the back of the throat, past the vocal cords, and into the trachea. This allowed me to control his breathing and prevent blood from draining into his lungs. We quickly moved him to the gurney, wheeled him through the house, and out the front door on the way out to the truck. Of course, we passed his wife and daughter. I don't think I'll ever forget the look on their faces. We transported him emergently to a trauma center. Later in the evening, I returned to the hospital to see if he was still alive. What happened next isn't easy to explain, but the man was sitting upright in bed, completely awake and obeying commands. The nurse told me that about an hour after I left the hospital, the patient sat up in bed and pulled the tube out from his trachea and nose. I was convinced that this man either had a head injury or brain injury from the lack of oxygen. It turns out he was plastered drunk, and if his wife would have found him a minute or two later, he wouldn't have survived. Next story. One of my closest friends works on an ambulance, so I hear pretty wild stories. He was first on scene to a freeway car accident at around 10 p.m. A car had flipped and was in the emergency lane. The people weren't too hurt, but they did have to load one person into the ambulance. As they're helping these people, he hears a really loud thud on the other side of the freeway. A car had hit a person who's trying to run across the freeway. He said the car must have been going 70 mph. He shines his flashlight and sees their body in a heap, probably 20 feet in front of the car. The car actually just drives off, and he thinks about hopping over the median to pull the guy off the road, but then notices tons of cars coming up the road going easily 70 plus mph as it was in the fast lane. He said he proceeded to watch 5 to 7 cars continuously run over this man's body until he was nothing but paste smeared across the road. This all happened before police and firefighters got on scene. Turns out, the person who had caused the accident had actually flipped their car as well, and it was off the right side of the road. Farther down, they hadn't initially seen it. They think that the person who caused the accident tried to flee the scene and run across the freeway, where they ended up getting run over. Next story. Charter plane crash into the side of a mountain in Alaska. 1 dead on impact, 4 in critical condition. The second guy we hoisted into the helicopter was so covered in blood, I assumed he was dead. One of the survivors of the crash was elderly and had a heart attack as soon as he was pulled from the wreckage and died. It took 3 hours to hoist the 3 survivors. A brown bear was watching from a few hundred feet off the whole time. I assumed he smelled blood. Next story. I'm not sure if this counts as a first responder, but it'll always stick with me. I was a lifeguard for many years when I was in high school and college. I've done plenty of saves and saw a couple losses in the various places I've worked. The one that stuck with me was a toddler that ran from his mother to chase a ball he dropped. I sprinted across a 100-meter pool and pulled him out of the shallow end, only to turn around and see his mom was busy ordering food from our snack bar and didn't even notice her child was about to drown. If I didn't see him as he dropped and followed the ball, he could have been drowning. When I handed her a wet baby, she replied, "Thanks," and just left like nothing happened. How oblivious can you be, and how ungrateful that is? Ugh, man, that kind of triggered me a little bit, not gonna lie. Horrible. Next story. My neighbor flies a rescue helicopter and picks up medical emergencies that are difficult to reach by road. One day, he flew to meet EMTs who were providing aid in a remote area to someone who had tried, and failed, to self-unalive. When the helicopter arrived, the patient was informed that he was going to be loaded aboard and brought to a hospital. "I'm not going up in one of those things," the patient said. "They're dangerous." Next story. I have three. One was a motorcycle versus deer. Motorcycle and driver were both fine. Deer got cut in half, but was still alive when we got there. It was screaming. I'm a city boy, and I'd never heard a deer make any noise in my life. The paramedic I was with walked over to the deer and dispatched it. Two was a guy who had just dropped his kids off at his ex-wife's house, walked around to her front porch, sat down, put his shotgun under his chin, and pulled the trigger. He was still alive when we got there, but died shortly after we got him to the hospital. Third, a guy and his wife were drunk driving down some old country roads, fleeing from the police. The road doglegged, but the vehicle didn't and went straight into a tree. We got the call that there is an entrapment and the vehicle was on fire. By the time we arrived, the fire department had already put out the fire. The husband had climbed out of the truck and ran. They caught up with him in a creek bed and tased him. They had to use the jaws of life to get his wife out. When they pulled her out, her right foot was hanging on by about 4 inches of skin and a tendon. The surgeons saved the foot. Next story. Two girls drove drunk and crashed. One girl was a traumatic arrest. While trying to intubate her, the tube kept hitting something in her throat. It was her spine. She had become internally decapitated, and her spine was now inside of her throat. Game over. Also, responded to a wellness check. Person had been dead in the hot summer for approximately a month. The whole house was hot, thick, and moist inside. Particles of warm, decomposing flesh were floating in the air and resting on your skin. There was nothing left of the guy except a skeleton covered in thick black goo. Next story. Motorcyclist flipped a car, came off their bike at insane speed and hit a lamppost. Part of their body stopped at the post and the other part went 20 yards down the road. "Mummy, wet balloons!" exclaimed a child in the impacted car, pointing at the guts of a man linking the two halves. Next story. Not by any means the worst thing I've witnessed, but maybe the craziest. A few years ago, right after Christmas, we get a call to a house for unaliving. The wife unalived herself in the garage and the husband found her and had cut her down. By the time we got there, the husband had vomit all over his face from where he was giving the wife mouth to mouth, and you could tell she was probably too far gone. Anyways, we still work her through the whole protocol and end up calling it a short time later. The husband was obviously devastated and extremely distraught, and by the time we had left the scene and PD had arrived, we knew that family was coming from out of town for support of the husband and the family's children. Well, like 4 hours later, we get a call back to the same address for a self-inflicted gunshot wound. When the husband's family had arrived from out of town, he went into his bathroom and blew his head off with an AR-15, sitting on the toilet. He also blew off the tank reservoir of the toilet, so water was leaking, which created this little stream of blood in the grout of the tile all the way to the bedroom floor. I've seen a lot of self-inflicted gunshot wounds, but the way this dude's head was concaved in was wild. This couple had 4 kids, all under the age of 8, who were in the house for both of their parents self-unaliving just hours apart from one another. Christmas decorations still hung throughout the house and new toys everywhere. I can't imagine what the family members from out of town must have been thinking or where those little kids are at in life now. Horrible story. This is the kind of stuff that leads to like ghost stories and haunted houses and stuff. I don't think anyone could ever possibly live in that place of residence again. And also, come on, like 2 parents unaliving and leaving behind their children that's heartbreaking. Next story. Worked as a part-time paramedic after high school. Craziest call I had was when a man called in complaining of severe stomach pains. When we got to his house, we stopped dead in our tracks when we walked in and saw at least 2 big bottles of vodka next to him, empty. This dude had drank so much alcohol that he was suffering from severe alcohol poisoning. After we transported to a hospital, we ran a BAC test to determine how much he had drank. He had a BAC of around 0.39. The legal limit in our state is 0.08. Next story. My dad was a local city PD officer. He made defective while I was a preteen. One day, when I was 15, a buddy of his laughingly asked if I had seen The Ugly Book. I said no. This dude asked my dad if he could show me, and my dad says, why not? The Ugly Book was made up of photographs of crime scenes too brutal to be printed in the newspaper. Hydraulic brake failure sliced off someone's head? Yep, saw that. Car burned so bad you could only see the teeth of the guy who had been in the fire? Yep, that too. Up close, detailed imagery of the genitals that a predator cut off himself before unaliving himself from a tree? Sure, why not? Next story. When I was a brand new EMT, I was starting to get comfortable with my partner, and he was starting to trust me a little more to bring in lower acuity staff. Well, it was Halloween night 2021, around 2 a.m., and we were sent out to this shack way out in the cuts. We get there, and these younger Hispanic guys lead us into a room in the back where their grandma was. This lady straight up looked like a bruja. Super skinny and very old Hispanic lady. She was wearing tattered clothes and hadn't bathed in a long time. Hair was all matted and dirty. She had fallen down and smacked her head on the corner of something, and she was on blood thinner, so her face was completely covered in blood. Like every inch. The wildest thing was, she was demented and nonverbal, so she communicated through pointing and kind of cackling. No effing joke. My partner tells me this is BLS, low acuity, and asks if I'd be okay taking her in. I honestly wasn't, but I didn't want a female dog out. So here I was, a fresh EMT on Halloween, bouncing around in the back of an ambulance with this bruja, all covered in blood and effing cackling at me and pointing at absolutely nothing. When we tried to clean up her wound, she would swing at us, so we brought her in as is. The ER thought it was a Halloween prank. Next story. For approximately 6 weeks, I was a dispatcher for a large county covering 27 plus cities, villages, townships, etc., and we were also linked to state troopers. After only 6 weeks at this job, I was pretty much convinced it was not for me. My view of the world changed rapidly, and I couldn't stop myself from taking all the problems home in my head. The call that sealed the deal that I was not cut out for this, a man called and said that his baby mama was a prostitute, and that she had been moving from motel to motel with their 6-month-old daughter who he didn't have custody of. Another prostitute that knew her called him to inform him that his infant daughter had died and his baby mama was carrying her around with her in a suitcase because she didn't know what to do with the body. The guy on the phone was very upset and said that he was out looking for her amongst what he planned on doing to her when he found her. That was it for me. I put in my 2 weeks the next morning. God bless you, first responders. Most of us can't do what you do. Next story. My half-brother, who, along with an older sister, was abandoned by her drug addict father and grew up in South Jersey without ever meeting him. A decade later, Pop started another family an hour north that included me, an older sister, and my drug addict mother. Between the two of them, they racked up 4 DUIs in the 90s before the state took me out in 1999 after a lifetime of abuse. But not before the 2-year family trip we took with cocaine. All of my pop's DUIs occurred along the stretch of freeway that runs from Camden, where we lived, to South Jersey, where pop's parents lived. Imagine this deadbeat and wiry drug addict. Then, who is flying down the road in a Dodge Caravan with the speakers perfectly equalized to average white band getting pulled over? The arresting officer? An angry, stacked Jersey state trooper with the same eyes. Karma. Next story. 2 of the less gruesome. Came in as a self-unaliving attempt. We showed up and found this teenage girl with deep gashes all over her body, curled up in a blood-soaked bed. She was still breathing, and at least somewhat conscious, so we were trying to get her to talk. Out of nowhere, she uncurls, reaches under her pillow, lunges for us with her bloody shard of glass. As it would turn out, she decided to drop hallucinogens with no preparation, alone. It wasn't a self-unaliving attempt. It was only that she'd realized that her veins were full of ants. On another occasion, my engine crew went looking for a reported wreck alongside the road. We couldn't find it, but we all observed that it smelled right and kept looking. Finally, we found skid marks off on a hillside. Where was our wreck? Why, upside down, lodged in a tree, as wrecks do. Next story. It was a hot, late summer day until the compressor blades broke apart on takeoff and plunged a DC-9 into the ground in a little used park area. I was working as a detective at the time and was one of the first units on scene while the flames were still being put out. Spent the next 4 hours pulling out and bagging bodies. Only PPE was latex gloves. The boss didn't want the FD to do it. We started with 4 officers to a body bag. By the last body, we were using 8 because of the exhaustion. The plane had flipped in the air and came almost straight down. The bodies pretty much burnt beyond recognition. Were stacked in some places, one on top of the other. One department member grabbed an arm to pull the top body off, and it came out of the socket to slap him in the face. We got one body pried apart and there was vomit on their chest, indicating that they knew what was happening before the plane crashed. 31 souls were lost that day. Next story. Older female being horribly neglected by her husband/caretaker. This older lady, in her 70s, fell down early summer and we had a crew go out there to go check on her. She was alert and able to make her own choices. She refused EMS care and decided to stay on the floor. A few months go by and we get called out there again. We walk into the small home and instantly smell human crap/rotting flesh. She's still on the floor, on the same side with a blanket covering her. We lift the blanket and she only had a shirt on, is covered in crap and piss with open, clearly infected wounds with bugs in them. She's able to grunt in pain and nothing else. There's weeks worth of crap in this tiny room she's in. Her husband is behind us yelling, "I can't do this anymore," and other crap. We call for help and PD and attempt to move this woman. We struggle to move her as she had been laying in the same spot for so long that she had been fused into the carpet floor by all her bodily fluids. We rip her off the floor like a band-aid, which makes more wounds, and carry her outside. Her poopy legs rubbed against my pants, and my partner got some form of fluids on him that ate through his pants. It literally looked like someone threw acid on this dude's crotch. PD has us on body cam throwing up. We transport her and she dies 3 days later to sepsis. PD decides not to pursue charges on her husband because he was too old. Next story. State trooper here. An old guy crosses into the oncoming lane and hits head on with a lifted Suburban. Lifted Suburban drives up and over the windshield on the driver's side. The tire ends up making contact with the old guy's head and pops it like a zit. Brain matter came out of the side of his head. His face was mostly intact, but you could look into his empty skull cavity where his brain used to be. Next story. I'm not a first responder, but a bizarre accident happened to my cousin. She was prone to having seizures and had a particularly bad one. My grandmother, who was raising her, called 911 and an ambulance arrived. The driver was a young woman that was alone, and as she was rushed towards my grandmother's house, she tripped and fell face first into a sprinkler. It went through her face and up into her mouth. My grandmother had to call another ambulance for my cousin and the driver. Next story. Not me personally, but very close to it as I live in a very small rural town with volunteer EMS and FD. EMS responded to the scene of an accident and take 2 people to the hospital. On the way, they're T-boned by a semi hauling grain. The ambulance bursts into flames as it rolls into a house's yard. The homeowner runs out and drags everyone out. The 2 patients and the 2 EMTs in the back were dead. One of the EMTs was the ambulance's driver's wife. The driver was badly injured but drags himself to his wife's body and laid on her sobbing until the squad from the next town over arrived. This is a strong man, and it breaks my heart every time I talk to him. He remarried, and his current wife is now the head EMT for our volunteer department. He's now a county sheriff's deputy and owns the gun shop right down the street. See him every day. I live next door to the fire department, where there's a monument honoring the crew. Next story. Not the craziest, but memorable. We were on an interior attack on a fire in the living room of a single-family residence. We had made our way to the seat of the fire and were working that when I happened to look over a shelf near the couch that was full of different types of knickknacks and saw a tiny brass frog sitting in a tiny brass tub full of foamy water. At some point during our entry, we had sprayed the shelf and the water/foam from our hose filled the tub. I don't know why it sticks in my head so much, much, but that little frog staring back at me in a tub filled with sudsy water in a room full of fire still makes me chuckle. Shortly after, a small piece of the ceiling fell into the collar of my coat as I looked down at something and burned me between the shoulder blades. Next story. Went to a car wash involving a side impact into a concrete pole at 160 kph. Another crew member and I sat behind the destroyed B-pillar, holding his mostly open skull shut. He was somehow conscious and repeatedly asked us if he was going to die, to which we had to keep lying and tell him he was going to be fine. We were in there for about 10 minutes with him, which felt like an hour, before the ambulance helicopter landed with some absolutely badass trauma specialists who managed to keep him alive long enough for the airlift to the hospital. Anyway, it turns out we weren't actually lying to him. He ended up making a full recovery, which was literally a miracle from my point of view, given how he was when we found him. We don't usually get closure on these sorts of jobs, but a week after the rescue, the patient's tearful mother showed up at the firehouse to thank us and let us know he was in a good place, and also gave us what still to this day is the best tasting cake I've ever seen. So yeah, once again, just wanted to take a quick second to highlight a positive story. Could have been traumatic and awful, but not only did he recover, but OP and partner got some amazing cake, so everybody wins here. Hoorah! Next story. I was the new volunteer firefighter for my small community with next to nothing for first aid training at the time other than basic CPR, Heimlich, etc. While off work, hanging out at the local water hole with my family, I heard the call for a roll over the T intersection that connected the water hole. I immediately left and was the first on scene that could administer help. It was a 17-year-old male in a truck that drove straight into the embankment at the T. He was ejected through the front windshield, and subsequently, the truck rolled up the embankment over him and then rolled back down over him. He was still alive and still taking shallow breaths. All I could do was hold him still from convulsions. His entire chest and head felt like a water balloon. He had no bone structure left, and when we went to put the neck brace on, I'll never forget the feeling of his face in my hands. He unfortunately suffered tremendously before his death. He lived for hours after the accident and passed on the flight for life. He crashed trying to act cool for the girls in the car behind him, as was their statement on the scene. I still feel that feeling in my hands, like in my soul. It's too much. Next story. Not an EMT, but a coworker is a retired EMT with lots of stories. One that sticks with me was the two teenage girls that made a self-unaliving pact. They got a hold of one of the girl's father's .22 pistol, and the first girl used it on her head. After witnessing this, the second girl decides that this was not such a great idea and calls the paramedics. Coworker thought it was funny the second girl was asking why she has to go in an ambulance, and she's fine. Yeah, right, sweetie, you're going to psych. Next story. I've definitely commented on this before, but had to on this post too. My wife's uncle works at a fire department in Minnesota, and he responded to a motorcycle accident. They couldn't find the rider for a bit, and then, all of a sudden, they hear a clickety-clack sound and look to see the motorcyclist walking towards them, all toe bones exposed, which was making that sound against the pavement. Dude was in complete shock and was asking him why there were so many sirens and lights around. They got him in the ambulance, and adrenaline probably wore off soon after, but he survived, which is good. Next story. Been an EMT for about 5 years, mostly part-time through college and as a side hustle. Been to shootings, full arrests, respiratory, DOAs, and more overdoses than I can count. But my most unexpected story comes from early in my career. We were about halfway through our shift, and my partner was the darkest black cloud I've ever worked with. For those who don't know, some people in EMS just seem to attract gnarly calls like a magnet, and we call them black clouds. Shift had been pretty chill so far, so I stupidly assumed it would continue like that. We get dispatched cold, as in no lights or sirens, to a headache at a church not far from us. My partner was the senior EMT on the shift, so I'm driving at the moment, and he puts on some M&M while we make our way down there. Walk into the church, and the first thing I hear is, "What took you so long? My grandmother just went blind." Now, if sudden blindness isn't setting off alarm bells, that plus headache really should be. As it was a headache, and we were just in the lobby of a building, not going up elevators or anything. We had just walked into the building with nothing. My partner takes one look at the patient and says, "Get the stretcher out, we're leaving." We get her loaded up, I check her blood sugar and stroke scale her while my partner calls the receiving hospital and gives them a report. Stroke scales are scored out of 4, with anything less than a 4 out of 4 being a roughly 90% chance of being a stroke. This patient scored a 0. You best believe we took that patient to the hospital hot. While we were driving, the patient had intervals where she would stop breathing before coming back around. As we got to the hospital, I noticed my partner has placed the AED pads on her. We took that patient directly up to imaging. And that was my lesson to myself as to why you can never truly trust your dispatch. Next story. Firefighter ran on a call that came in as an electrocution. Upon arrival, we smell something burning and we see smoke coming from behind a house. I hadn't put my bunker gear on since we thought it was a medical call. I put my bunker gear on and got off the engine, and in the road, a guy was standing there, shirtless, with all of his skin falling off. Looked like a zombie. Luckily, the ambulance was there and they grabbed him and left. I grabbed a hose and ran back out into what can only be described as a hoarder backyard that was on fire. Turns out, he wanted to grill some chicken at 11 p.m. but had no propane, so he loaded his grill with sticks and grass and threw a match. No electrocution. I've seen plenty of other wild things, but that one stands out in my mind. Next story. Not myself, but my mom was a paramedic for a small country area. There's 2 stories I can't forget. Crazy, unexpected. Mom and her partner got called to the local bar down from the bowling alley. Full moon. They were trying to get the officer to make more of a description of what the situation was, only repeating, "Head trauma to victim, bus needed right now." They pull up and my mom goes to one person and her partner to the other for their initial assessments. Mom walks up to the ROs and a chick. The guy cop is obviously uncomfortable. The victim is bleeding badly, not showing signs of fainting or anything. Oh, her Adam's apple is moving. Her Adam's apple is moving. My mom and the guy's partner couldn't stop laughing at him from calling him by the wrong pronouns and getting all sassy responses from the victim. The whole thing was just pointless. The victim had been dressing as a woman, entered the men's bathroom, and proceeded to use the urinal when confronted from behind by a male telling them to leave before something happens, and proceeds to smash the victim's head into the countertop of the sinks. Victim gets up and takes the attacker to the cleaners because the victim is actually a professional boxer doing something in town. I don't remember for sure. Mom and her partner left howling. Craziest, sad, and neglectful. Quiet night for the station. 2 calls before they got a usual overdose call that hadn't happened in a while. The kid, young adult male aged, had a parent that worked in our country courts as some official. I don't think a judge, but along those lines. He'd go party with the friends. Friends would watch him OD, put him in his car, leave him somewhere near where they were partying, and then call 911 as they drove off. Mom said it had been 5 to 6 calls since she came back to work less than a year ago when they were on his final OD. His dad was bawling his eyes out, saying he didn't try hard enough to get him help. Mom said that he was dead before he even got to the car. His dad resigned that week and got divorced not too long after. The kid's friends were all prosecuted for negligences something. The autopsy proved that they had been involved with him after he had died. Next story. Not a first responder, but kind of a funny story depending on how you define crazy. I once stayed in a psychiatric hospital for depression and wanting to self-unalive thoughts. Anyway, during my stay, there were 2 people with schizophrenia. One man I'd known for a couple weeks. The woman came a couple days later. I could have a conversation with the dude, but he'd have his moments of paranoia. He watched the woman come in screaming and yelling, saying, "Get the things off me." The dude looked directly at me when he was taken out of the room and said, "Yo, that chick is effing crazy. Am I right, SA?" By far the funniest memory I have. What a great dude, too. Next story. My dad was a cop in California in the 80s, was driving around dead around 2 a.m. and saw a figure coming out of the fog. A shirtless guy who later turned out to be on PCP, with his right arm below the elbow hanging on by about a centimeter of skin on one side. He walked up to my dad's car, bright and happy as could be, and said, "Hi, officer, my name is Snowplow through Dirt Clod." More than a little freaky, needless to say. Next story. Too many to count. I was a firefighter for many years and lived near a busy highway. The one that stands out was an accident between a Jeep and a semi on the single lane. Two guys in their 20s, body parts all over the highway. Someone must have been talking on a cell phone at the time of collision because it was laying there ringing non-stop. I was walking around with a body bag picking up body parts with my captain, and the phone was just laying there ringing. There was also money scattered around everywhere, and it was starting to snow. This was almost 20 years ago, and I can still picture everything perfectly. Next story. Not my story, but one I was told by a psychiatrist. He gets called in to do a session with a recent arrest. The guy was reported running around naked, so obviously police show up to get this man out of the eyesight of children, which is important because he was in a school zone, with a dead dog on his chicken the whole time. He was running from the cops because he didn't want them to take his dog away. Yep, he was in full-on psychosis. Turns out the guy had a history of mental health issues and drug abuse, so when he found out his dog passed away, he absolutely snapped. Understatement of the year, I know. I can imagine how it must have felt to be told that before getting locked in a room with him. I hope the guy got the help he needed, though. It's sad as hell thinking about how his dog was the only thing keeping him sane. Just to add to this one a little bit, I see where I live a lot of homeless and mentally ill people out and about on the streets, but a lot of them have dogs, and it's like a coping mechanism. It's like companionship. The pureness, the innocence of an animal that's just going to love you no matter how much money you have. So yeah, this is a very real thing. There are some people where like their dogs are all they have. Next story. I read this one on another forum. U.S. police, 13-year-old boy been left alone and two guys had broken in the front door. The dad had some insane antique rifle or shotgun. Anyway, this boy used it. They were in a hallway. Both were dead by the time the responders arrived. Massive exit wounds. Anyway, that's not what stood out. It was the father screaming and cursing his teenage kid for touching the antique weapon because it could have been damaged. Next story. Oh boy, I've seen quite a few things, but I'll just stick to sharing two. I'll cut this one short because it's a long story, but it ended with us trying to wrestle a patient down to get him into the restraints while he was covered from the neck down in crap. While we were doing this, he reached into his pants and grabbed a huge handful of fresh crap that he then tried to smear on us. Second was a patient whose face literally rotted off from cancer. He had bugs eating the remaining flesh on his face, and they'd eaten through one of his eyes, leaving a huge hole in his skull. The smell was unlike anything I've ever smelled before and will haunt me forever. The crazy thing about this patient, though, was that he was fully conscious, ambulatory, and verbal. Next story. Not something I myself witnessed, but two stories told by my late police officer dad. A woman had fallen through ice in the winter, been missing until spring, and the body was discovered and needed to get fished out of the water. My dad and his partner managed to loan a boat from a local to do it, and they got up close to the floating cadaver to pull it up and into the boat. As they're doing it, due to the decomposition, it separates in half at the waist. Another funny story. My dad and 3 other officers are responding to a call about 2 drunk, drugged-up guys causing a ruckus and threatening people at a house in a neighborhood bordered by a forested area. Once my dad and his colleagues arrive and the drunks notice the police, both guys bolt into the brush almost immediately. My dad's partner gets a brilliant idea and shouts, "Get back here or we'll sick the dog on you," and turns to my dad. Dear old dad is quick on the uptake and starts growling and barking as convincingly as he can immediately. Fast forward about 30 seconds and 2 very anxious, inebriated gentlemen come running back with their hands up, begging them to restrain the dog and arrest them. He had other stories about people eating shotguns and the like, but I don't think they were unique enough for this thread. Next story. Not a first responder, but an ECC vet nurse. One of my first triages as a baby nurse was a dog who had been HBC a few days prior. Unfortunately, it isn't uncommon for people to leave HBC trauma animals for a few days because they seem fine externally, but this was a bit different. Elderly German Shepherd owner was camping in the bush and was reversing his car when he ran over his dog's hind end. He said he didn't realize at first because he thought the dog would have gotten out of the way. The dog couldn't move but wasn't complaining, so he continued camping for the night. Next day, he hoped the dog would die by itself if it was that injured. He left it in his car in freezing temps wrapped in a tarp and gave it some of his own opioids hoping it would help the dog pass. It didn't. By day 3, he finally decided he should get the dog to the vet. Now, suggesting euthanasia is not a nurse's role, but sometimes you can look at cases and know that prognostically, there isn't much else that can be done. I asked him what he was expecting outcome-wise. As if they want youth, we try our best to prioritize them if possible, so sometimes we'll prompt them to feel comfortable admitting it. There's still a lot of shame with people acknowledging they want to euthanize their pet. He looked at me as if I was insane and said, "I want you to fix my dog, obviously." With the help of a few other staff members, we hoisted this dog out of his car onto a trolley. As we pulled it out, urine and feces that had pooled around his back legs within the tarp poured onto us. The ammonia and necrosis that hit our noses made us gag and tear up. Once we got the dog into the treatment area and attempted to remove him from the tarp to assess his injuries, we were able to acknowledge how mangled his back end was. The owner was an emotional wreck when he realized how bad it was, and thankfully the dog was euthanized. Surprisingly, this is one of the cases that doesn't keep me up at night. If anything, I just feel sorry for the dog, and for the owner's well-intentioned ignorance causing unnecessary suffering in his attempt to relieve his dog's pain. Next story. A guy unalived himself in his apartment. We roll up in the ambulance to declare the body, and he had done it a month prior, but no one had found him. It was an apartment building, and the flies and smell were everywhere. You could smell it from outside. I poked my head in while wearing an N95, and all I could see through the mass flies was this decomposed black mass hanging on a closet door. Not to be funny, but it looked like that SpongeBob character in the wheelchair. Couldn't even tell it was a person. It just looked like a thing. It was wild. Next story. My grandfather was a firefighter for the USAF. He had more stories than I'd like to count or that he'd like to talk about, but one in particular ate at him until the very day he died. His truck had gotten called to the runway for failed landing gear on a cargo plane. Nothing out of the ordinary. He had a tradition to have a smoke with his best friend, a mechanic, after almost every shift, both to remember the good times and forget the bad. On his way to the maintenance hangar, he heard a bang he'd never heard before, so knowing something was wrong, he ran the rest of the way to the hangar to find his best friend crushed underneath an F-16 due to a jack slipping out. He was squished like a grape, with his mangled body lifeless. His head both caved in and exploded from the impact. Brains shot across the hangar and a trail of blood in its path. There was nothing he or anyone could have done, but it haunted him for the rest of his life. Next story. I responded to 3 simultaneous fatalities. It's a sleepy town, so when it first came in as a call, it was strange. I remember quite clearly pulling up to the house and seeing a face of a distraught father. My heart sunk. I knew the man and his family. They were good people. I ran into the house to see 3 young adults dead on the floor. The youngest was 19, and I just saw all 3 of them last night at the start of my shift. They were friendly to me and joking before I left that evening. I checked on 2 of them that were laying on their backs and pulses were gone. One of the victims was in a sitting position, so I pushed her to her back to check her vitals. I didn't know it at the time, but when I rolled her back, I heard air expand in her chest, and it was just air expanding. I had a moment of hope and thought one of them lived. I had a moment of relief and thought about how rough a recovery this was going to be for her. And I went to begin CPR, and then I saw her face. Her eyes were partially closed, her skin tinged blue, blood running down her face and her body stiff. All hope I had was gone. For weeks I had nightmares about them, and sometimes my brain would see them in public and would have to remind myself that who I saw wasn't those people. They died. I spoke to the victims' parents quite a lot and was berated by one of them for not doing enough, and it hurt. The victims were all good people, just got exposed to fentanyl at a party from some other drugs. I've dealt with other things afterwards, but that moment of hope lost when I thought I could start CPR broke me for a long time. Next story. During my summer break, I was accompanying my father on the job. Pretty unofficial, but works, as it's India. He gets a call about a train-related accident, and we rush to the spot. A daily wage laborer is walking on tracks to cut down the travel time to his work, but has earphones on, so doesn't hear the train coming. Gets cut into pieces, as the train drags his body and smashes him against an overpass bridge pillar. Spent all afternoon searching for parts of the body. When we get to the hospital, the doctor's assistant had to roll his face back onto what's left of his skull to be able to identify him. Next story. Park ranger here. You would think park ranger is a happy, fun job, till you realize parks are one of the #1 destinations for people to off themselves. I worked graveyard shift for a while, while. One night I was closing a park, so I'm driving around telling pretty much anyone remaining to get out until I approach one vehicle that's kind of at the beginning of a trail, kind of hidden. I was assuming it was a couple looking for a spot, but got no response when using my vehicle's PA. Few minutes go by and I saw no movement, but I go down to check. There is a guy in his underwear with his seat reclined all the way with dried blood coming from his eyes and nose and ears, bloated already and going into rigor mortis. Guy had been sitting in that car dead in the Florida sun for about a week, and no one saw him. And the smell, man, that crap you don't confuse with any other smell. It was by far the worst crap I ever smelled. Saw some other, but that was the worst one due to it already starting the decomposing stage. Next story. Someone tried to outrun a train. They lost. Killed all 3 occupants in the car, and the bodies were thrown hundreds of feet. Dead body that was left in an apartment, and the dead guy started oozing through his downstairs neighbor's ceiling. Another dead body left unattended, and cats had began feasting. Next story. Not an EMT, but I trained and qualified to be an EMT and paramedic. I was doing my advanced pediatric care training and covered a lot of burns. Our instructor was a really nice advanced paramedic, ex-Army guy with decades of experience. He told a story of a fire they had to attend. There was a badly burnt baby there. He told us all the horrors and how the skin of the baby stuck to his gloves. The baby was in extreme pain, obviously, but they couldn't do much to help besides transport. He was severely traumatized by this years after it happened. My wife was pregnant at the time. Seeing his experience and hearing this made me rethink my plans, and I changed my career a few months later. Next story. As a kid in Pakistan, I watched 2 guys chase a man down a street, around the corner, and back up the other way on the adjacent street. My home was connected in a way you could walk the entire length of 2 back-to-back homes on the roof that we shared with our neighbor. I watched the 2 men chasing, stop, pull out AK-47s, and gun the other man down. Still see it clear as day whenever I remember it. Also learned that day guns sound nothing like in the movies. Next story. Not a first responder, but I helped with the search. 2 trains collided head-on, doing 70-plus mph. One engine went over the other one, and the guy in the bottom one basically became one with the engine. The engine that went over the top had an instructor and trainee. The instructor had thrown the trainee out before impact, hoping she would survive. Her body was never found, only the massive smear when she got hit. The instructor made it 13 months before ending it all with a 12-gauge shotgun and being found by his 5-year-old daughter. Next story. Responded to a car versus PED. Arrived on scene to find vehicle occupied by 2 people. Driver had upper body and head trauma. Passenger had severe upper body and head trauma and no pulse. The vehicle had significant front-end damage and windshield was totally busted out, but we couldn't find what or who did it. Female driver was unconscious. She came to while we were popping the door and went apecrap when she saw the passenger. It turns out it was the person she hit sitting in the seat like they belonged there. Next story. Run up to a car crashed in a ditch. Guy is pinned between steering wheel and seat, has a branch sticking out of his eye socket, not moving. I say, well damn, he died. And he replied, nah, but I feel like it. Ended up just losing sight in one eye. Lots of scars and broken ribs, but otherwise okay. Yes, he got to keep the branch after surgery. That's kind of a boss move. You get impaled through the eye with a stick and you just hear the paramedics, saying that you're dead and you're like, nah, actually I'm good. I feel like crap, but I'm still breathing. That's how you own the moment. Next story. Had a guy die alone in a house. Hottest day of the year when we entered, and he had been deceased for around 3 weeks. Found this out later. He was a large male and had died in bed. Undertakers needed assistance moving him from the bed to a stretcher. When they pulled back the covers, his groin and upper leg area was covered in bugs. I was coping fine until we moved him and his groin region disintegrated, causing his legs to pop off. I needed a minute outside before I could go back in. The smell was unreal and one I'll never forget. Next story. Solo vehicle collision with a large debris field. Chevy truck drove off the side of the highway, overturned, and the top of the cab was ripped off, gibbing the occupant. The PED spread, yes, a term we use. is pretty substantial and well into some ice plant planted on the side of the highway. The truck has a damaged child car seat, still kinda half in it, with the top torn off and the belts torn. So we're digging through this ice plant looking for a possible missing child, or pieces of one, and I keep coming up with extra organs. Like there's a piece of a heart and it's not quite adult-like. It's off, but it's a heart. Same thing, I find a liver, but it's not quite right to be the driver's. Is it a child's liver? Anyways, I continue finding organs, like a third lung and crap like that, while dispatch is trying to hunt down the family to see if the kid is accounted for, or if it's somewhere out there. Finally, they track down Grandma, who has the kid. Around the same time, I find a dog's ear, and it all makes sense. Homeslice was driving to put down his dog and rolled his truck. He was a suspended police officer that had just gone to the funeral of a fellow officer he killed when he rolled his Jeep driving drunk off duty. Alcohol was a factor then. Not enough of him to determine if alcohol was a factor this time, but witnesses say it was not a self-unaliving. Best we could tell, his dog just caused him to crash. Not the craziest by far, not even that crazy for a fatal, but one I'm willing to share. I never really liked Ice Plant, but I kind of despise it after that day. Next story. This job happened to me about 4 years ago, and I still see it in my sleep. Got a call for a welfare check for a female who had called her recently ex-husband and was crying and making comments of not wanting to be alive anymore. The ex-husband called for a welfare check on her, as this was very out of character for her, and that they also had a child recently before their separation, and she was suffering from postnatal depression, and he had general concerns. It was about 2 a.m., and my partner and I arrived at the address we were given, and the house was in total darkness, which is often usual for welfare checks at this time. And we approached the house and knocked on the door, and the door was unlocked. We announced ourselves and slowly entered the house and found the woman standing in her lounge room holding her baby, and she was crying. When she turned around to face us, we could very, very, very clearly see that the baby's neck was broken and had passed. My partner pressed his duress button so that we could have a police response as I approached her, slowly trying to calm her down and tell her that we're here to help her, and she then proceeded to use her baby as a weapon against us, swinging it by its leg at us. Police arrived after. We had no choice but to leave the scene, mostly because we couldn't restrain her and for our own sanity. Police then faced the same treatment from the woman and subsequently had to wrestle her while she was holding her deceased baby. The transport to hospital was one of the quietest drives I've ever had in the job. Found out from another friend of mine in the job that she successfully took her own life about a month later.